An army sergeant professed his love to his girlfriend for the first time, causing her to laugh in his face. That was when he completely snapped. Before we start, how about freeing up some time in your schedule with HelloFresh? Whenever you're busy, they can take care of the meal planning and prepping, freeing up extra time in your schedule. The ingredients come pre-proportioned, the recipes are foolproof, and each meal is delivered right to your door. They make cooking easy with great recipes made with fresh, wholesome ingredients brought right to you. No waiting in lines, no hassle, just some great tasting food that you can whip up and enjoy right at home. HelloFresh has 40 weekly recipes to choose from for all sorts of meal occasions, lifestyles, and preferences. You can have your pick from meals like soy glazed salmon with rice or mushroom and chive risotto. For today's video, I decided to try out the sweet chili pork and cabbage stir fry. The directions for this one were extremely simple and the whole thing only took a few minutes to make. Not to mention, it came out tasting great. Definitely worth a try. So go to HelloFresh.com and use code DIRETRIP60 for 60% off plus free shipping. Once again, go to HelloFresh.com and use code DIRETRIP60 for 60% off plus free shipping. Anitra Lachey Gunn had graduated from Westlake High School in Atlanta, Georgia, and gone on to Fort Valley State University, where she studied agriculture. Her life was going pretty good until she went missing on Valentine's Day in 2020. Due to the circumstances surrounding this, her case caught national attention. Anitra had been dating a man named DeMarcus Little since at least September of 2019. Their relationship wasn't the greatest. You could say it was tumultuous. Some of their texts have recently come to light that paint a pretty good picture of how their relationship actually was behind closed doors. For example, back in September of 2019, DeMarcus had texted Anitra that he was tired of being played, while Anitra said that she's tired of him picking fights with her, to which he responded, "Fight and deal with it." In a later text to DeMarcus, she said that his threats and abuse weren't going to stop her from leaving him. If only she had actually gone through with this, but the bickering texts continued for months. In October, a bigger argument took place between the two in which DeMarcus was pretty sure that she was texting another man, telling her, "Mercy has its limits." Shortly after, Anitra felt that the two should stop talking to each other. DeMarcus begged her for one last conversation, but she declined, saying that she felt she only ended up being manipulated each time they spoke. A bit later, it had appeared that the two had broken up. Despite this, Anitra called DeMarcus the love of her life. And then, adding credence to the claims of manipulation, DeMarcus sent her a string of texts at 2 a.m. one night, threatening to end his own life over the situation. It was likely that Anitra was sleeping, but she started responding again at around 8 a.m., sending a few texts asking if he was okay, begging him to return her phone calls. DeMarcus responded later on that day, saying that he was in the hospital, telling her that his attempt was not successful. I'm gonna be honest here, I wasn't able to find any information as to whether or not he actually did attempt or end up in the hospital, or if he just told her he did. It's kind of unclear. After this, the two continued to communicate, seemingly continuing their toxic on-again, off-again relationship. Throughout this time, DeMarcus was stationed in Augusta, Georgia, as he was a member of the U.S. Army. It seems he was still worried that Anitra was seeing someone else, this time worried that another man was going to take her out for her birthday, telling her, "We're going to have problems if you go out with him." Despite this being one of those off-again times, DeMarcus pulled the mercy card once again, saying that he was sparing the suspected other man, but threateningly informing her at the same time that he had God's reach. A while later, DeMarcus screenshotted a bunch of the texts between him and Anitra and sent them on to another person, who he asked for a favor. He wanted this mystery man to cause violent harm to whatever man that Anitra may or may not be dating. At some point after this, they must have made up to some extent, as DeMarcus went out to Fort Valley in December to visit her. He took this opportunity to steal her phone as he left. He told her that he merely only took it with him because he thought she was coming with him. She told him once again to stop being manipulative and bring her phone back. In January, DeMarcus came to Anitra's home and stood outside, begging for a hug and for her to text him back. Anitra told him that they can't be cool because of his behavior. Then February came along. On the 5th, DeMarcus had broken some windows at her apartment and slashed her tires, but Anitra didn't file a police report in relation to the vandalism. And then came Valentine's Day. On the morning of Valentine's Day, 2020, Anitra's father, Christopher, called her to wish her a happy Valentine's Day. Little did he know that would be the last time he would ever actually speak to her. The last time anyone would ever see her would be around 11:30 a.m., roughly. That day, DeMarcus came to Anitra in person and decided to confess his love to her. Given how the past year or so had went, Anitra was less than thrilled, especially since telling him off just recently the month before. She outright laughed in his face. At this point, DeMarcus completely snapped. He started strangling her right then and there. Once she lost consciousness, he realized exactly how badly he had messed up. He threw her body into the back of her own Chevy Cruze and sped off into the woods, damaging her car during the panic. He dumped her body in the woods, completely in a rush, and then drove off once again, knocking the bumper off of her car and leaving it there in the woods not too far off. He then abandoned her car in a village very nearby to where the two had last been seen together. DeMarcus phoned up his friend, Javon Ebron, and told him what he had done. He asked Javon to come out and help him retrieve the bumper of the car, hoping to cover his tracks at least a little. Javon complied, and the two did just that. But despite getting this help from his friend, DeMarcus then threatened him, telling him to never speak a word of this. For a while, he didn't, refusing to tell anyone even despite the threats against him. A short while after, Anitra's brother tried calling her only to get no response. Her father, then worried, asked a few of her friends to check up on her. More friends and family tried to get a hold of her, but to no avail. Then her father, Christopher, decided to call up the police and have them do a courtesy check on her. Nobody was found in their home, and it was noted that nothing in the residence looked out of place. Nothing indicated any sort of struggle or robbery. Anitra, though, was nowhere to be found. The next day, February 15th, Christopher went out to Fort Valley to file a missing persons report on his daughter. The police went out and looked for her, only to find her car on Bell Avenue in a neighbor's yard near her apartment. It was immediately clear that the front bumper was missing. The Georgia Bureau of Investigation took the car in for processing, noting that her wallet was still inside. Christopher was contacted by the police, who told them that they had found Anitra's phone, although they couldn't tell him exactly where. Later that day, the Fort Valley police issued a release asking for people nearby to be on the lookout for her. 2 days later, after not much more information had come to light, the Fort Valley Police and the Peach County Sheriff's Office formed a joint task force to help out in the search for Anitra. They patrolled the area both by car and by helicopter in hopes of finding some sort of clue as to where she had gone. About 24 volunteers helped out in the search as well, searching the area where she was last seen, which turned out to be the home of DeMarcus's aunt on Chestnut Hill Road. It's fairly safe to say that people started connecting the dots as to who might be involved. The sheriff released some photos of Anitra's car, saying that whoever had the bumper to the car likely knew what happened to her and where she was. Later that evening, the volunteers decided to turn in for the day, not having turned up much of anything. The next day, Crime Stoppers offered to give a $5,000 reward for any information that might lead to Anitra's location. The task force headed out to DeMarcus's aunt's home, hoping to collect any information that might prove helpful. The owner of the house wasn't home, so they searched the home by both ground and air, but didn't turn up anything. That rainy morning, Lieutenant Brian Stewart of the Peach County Sheriff's Office came to the conclusion that, if Anitra really had been harmed at that home, it was possible that her body wouldn't be too far away. He headed down the street to Wolf Oak Road, then on to Tanglewood Road, looking across the peach orchard and farms nearby. He then came across Greer Road when he noticed a path leading into the woods that looked like a car had recently recklessly driven through it. He drove a short distance into the woods before getting out of his car and walking a bit further. He then came across bits and pieces that appeared to have fallen off of a car. He Googled the part number on one of these pieces of plastic, which came back to say that it belonged to a Chevy Cruze. At that moment, he knew he had most likely found the place where Anitra's body would be found. He looked over to a tree with noticeable damage from a car and then lowered his eyes. This was when he came across the body. The Peach County Sheriff, Terry Deese, spoke out in a news conference, confirming that Anitra's body had been found, noting that her boyfriend was a person of interest in the murder. DeMarcus Little was found shortly after and taken in for an involuntary police interview. It wasn't the first time either, it was actually the third at this point. The police had already talked to him twice before, but this was the first time that they had some real hard evidence to go on. A few hours later, DeMarcus was arrested and charged. Then came the day of February 19, 2020. The Fort Valley Department of Safety confirmed that the body they found was indeed that of Anitra Gunn. Her father then released a statement thanking everyone who had helped volunteer to look for her. He asked for prayers and, above all, some privacy for the time being. The police noted that, although she hadn't filed a police report months prior, DeMarcus Little had very likely been the one who had vandalized her house as well. An autopsy was conducted on the body, which showed signs of strangulation from either hands or an arm around her neck. Abrasions were found on her neck, a bruise on her forehead, a bruise on her upper lip, injuries on both of her hips, and bleeding in the whites of her eyes. Crescent-shaped markings were also found along the left side of her neck, which seemed to have been from her own fingernails. The doctor stated that the injuries to her face occurred before her life was ended and likely were the result of being punched. The injuries to her lip had likely come from someone holding a hand over her mouth very tightly. The bleeding in the eyes was a result of choking. The abrasions, though, had likely taken place after death, probably happening while being dragged across the ground. Only 2 days later, DeMarcus was in court for a bond hearing. This hearing wasn't for the murder, but for the charges brought against him for the previous property damage. His day wasn't about to end that easily, though, being formally charged with malice murder just shortly after 5:30 p.m. The warrant revealed Anitra's cause of death as manual strangulation. Due to the severity of these charges, DeMarcus was not going to be granted bond. Once everything came to light, his friend Javon was arrested and charged as well, both for tampering with evidence and for making false claims to the police. DeMarcus continued to rot away in prison, awaiting his future trial. This trial wouldn't come for another 2 years. Along came the day of March 8, 2022. The first day of DeMarcus Little's trial was finally about to take place. In the opening statements from the prosecution, the jurors heard about how Anitra had laughed in DeMarcus's face on Valentine's morning when he professed his love to her. They were shocked to hear that this is why he killed her. DeMarcus had already confessed everything to his friend Javon, who told the story. They also heard testimony from both DeMarcus's aunt and a man that Anitra had been hanging out with in the last days of her life. The next day, the court heard the details of DeMarcus and Anitra's relationship, from the good to the bad, but mostly bad. Everything from the beginning up until her disappearance was brought to light. Needless to say, there was plenty of text evidence out there that didn't paint DeMarcus in the best light. 11 witnesses spoke as well, including the woman who had come to find Anitra's damaged car out in her yard that day. DeMarcus even voluntarily admitted to the police that he had damaged Anitra's home, which the police relayed to the court. Most of DeMarcus's defense revolved around the fact that he was a soldier. That's really all they had. A few days into the trial, the prosecution presented the gruesome photos of Anitra's body as it was found in the woods, along with the autopsy report. They even brought her car out to the parking lot of the courthouse for all the jurors to see. The car was still in the exact condition it was found in, with Anitra's purse still being in the seat. The next day, Javon Abron gave his testimony to the court, describing everything from DeMarcus's confession, saying that DeMarcus picked him up from a party and it all started from there. The details of his confession were very hard to hear, shocking the court, especially the family of the victim. The day after that was when the court saw all of the text messages we detailed in the beginning of this video, the whole chaotic on-again, off-again downward spiral. A lot of the testimony focused on tech during the days before Anitra went missing, things like text messages, their sent times, cache locations, and social media messaging. The messages were presented to the jury. It showed DeMarcus's fascination with the other men that Anitra might have been seeing, showcasing his possessiveness and paranoia. Location data from DeMarcus's phone showed that he was in the location very near to where Anitra's abandoned car ended up and where her body was found. The next day, DeMarcus took to the stand in his own defense. He hoped that, somehow, he could convince the jury that he didn't commit the murder. He said that Anitra was his soulmate, that he could have never done such a thing. The phone evidence, though, especially the location data, left a very large reason to doubt his claims. DeMarcus could not explain this part, stating that the data must have been mistaken at that specific period of time, even saying that the location data was correct at every other point of the day, just not that one. After 7 days of testimony and only 3 hours of deliberation, the jury found DeMarcus Little guilty of Anitra Gunn's murder.
Found not guilty on charges of malice murder, but charged with felony murder and aggravated assault. The DA asked the judge, Connie Williford, to please consider imposing the maximum sentence on him. DeMarcus was then sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. Once again, thank you for watching my video. If I look or sound a little weird in this one, it's probably because allergies are brutally kicking my ass. If you found the video interesting, please give it a like as it helps out in the algorithm, and subscribe if you want to see more content like this. If you want, go ahead and follow me on social media as well. If you want to support the channel even further, I even have a Patreon account which I keep linked down in the description below, and speaking of which, shout out to the top patrons. Today we have Travis Billings, Lettuce, Lord Fool, Jim Dowell, Kimmy Leffel, Melina Lee Williams-Haas, Motaz Hawk, Impalato, Steph and Jamie Kramer, Max Sword Guy, L, Rain Noir, Pao Yang, April Diamond, Starvade, Astral, Grack, Angie, Rick of Work in Progress USA, Sash Johnson, Marianne McCurdy, Buttery Frankus, Wifrans, Jules Latona, Arctic Cat, Alan Damiani, Adrian Lawley, Marsh, Rinsenstein, Kim Peak, Lux Alpaca, Charity, Scoochie Main, Jackie, and Mark Barnett. I profess my love to you. And go to HelloFresh.com and use code DIRETRIP60 for 60% off plus free shipping. This has been your host Kyle. Thank you and good night.